There is a specific kind of silence that follows certain expeditions, not the silence of empty hands or failed science. Those have their own grammar, their own vocabulary of acknowledged defeat. This is different. It belongs to people who came back having seen something and then said almost nothing at all. That is where I want to start. Not with a theory, not with a conclusion, with a logistical question that has been sitting at the edge of my thinking for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. If 12 trained scientists return from a multi-month Antarctic expedition with no publishable findings, what is the simplest explanation? I mean that genuinely. I'm not being rhetorical. If you take the 1947 Soviet-adjacent research mission, known in some declassified secondary documents as the Mirny Deep Interior Survey, and lay out everything we actually know about its departure, its trajectory, and its return, the shape that emerges is not incomplete. It is negative. It is the outline of something missing. The team departed in late austral summer, travelling beyond the mapped perimeter into the deep interior shelf. They carried instrumentation appropriate for geomagnetic, atmospheric, and glaciological study. 11 weeks later, they returned. They were debriefed, their equipment was logged, and then the expedition's findings were sealed. Not destroyed, sealed. That distinction has stayed with me, because destruction and sealing are not the same institutional act. Destruction says, this must not exist. Sealing says, this must not be seen yet. One is an ending, the other is a deferral, and deferral implies intention, and intention implies something worth deferring. Before I go any further, I want to be fair to the official record, because it does in fact have an explanation. The Soviet scientific program in 1947 was operating under extreme secrecy, not because of what was found, but because of what the expeditions themselves were. The Cold War was crystallizing. Any scientific mission producing geomagnetic data carried dual-use potential. Sealing the record was standard practice in that context, Antarctic geomagnetics, with implications for submarine navigation and ballistic trajectory calculation, carried real strategic value in 1947. That is a reasonable argument. It accounts for the institutional silence without requiring anything more exotic. I understand why most researchers stop here. I did for a while. The problem is one of the team members. His name was Alexei Gorbatov, a glaciologist, not a spy, not a politically sensitive figure by any measure of the available record. He survived the expedition by 31 years, dying in 1978. In that time, he published 11 papers, taught at Leningrad State University, gave lectures, and kept correspondence. And in all of that, 31 years, 11 papers, a full and productive academic career, he never mentioned the 1947 survey, not once. For a researcher with his output profile, that kind of total omission from a foundational field expedition is statistically almost impossible to explain through normal academic behavior. Researchers reference their own prior fieldwork constantly. It is how scientific careers are built. You might say he was instructed not to reference it. That's fair. Soviet academics operated under real constraints, and we shouldn't underestimate the reach of state instruction over published output. But two of his colleagues on the expedition, those whose names appear in the fragmentary departure manifests, also published prolifically afterward in different countries under different political systems, and they too never referenced the survey. One of them defected. He worked for nearly 2 decades in West Germany, publishing freely in NATO-aligned institutions with no Soviet editorial oversight. He could have said anything. He wrote about his early Arctic work, his training expeditions from the 1940s, instrument calibrations going back to 1939. But from 1947 there is a gap. A clean, specific 11-week gap in a man who otherwise had a meticulous autobiographical research record. What makes this particularly striking is the specificity of what he did discuss. He referenced precise details, dates, coordinates, personnel, instrument readings for almost every other period of his career. His professional memoir, written in German and published in 1971, covers 1939 through 1969 with careful fidelity. For a researcher who documented his scientific life with that level of detail, an 11-week gap is not an oversight. It is a choice. And choices, in a man who otherwise made no choices of this kind, demand explanation. He was not someone who avoided the archival record. He cultivated it, returned to it repeatedly, understood its value. The absence of those 11 weeks is not passive, it is active. Something caused him not to write it down, and then never to go back and fill it in. I don't want to overstate this. A gap is not a confession. A silence is not evidence of what was silenced. Absence of data is not data about absence. That is one of the most important principles in any careful investigation, and I try to hold it at all times. What I'm describing could still have a mundane explanation I simply haven't found. I want you to hold that possibility open alongside me. But then there is the equipment, specifically magnetometer readings partially recovered from an unrelated archival review in the 1990s, conducted by a Norwegian research team cross-referencing mid-century geomagnetic baselines. They were not looking for the Mirny survey. They found a reference to it in a footnote, noted it as a data source they couldn't access, and moved on. But in that footnote, there was a number, a measurement, a single geomagnetic anomaly reading from the deep interior shelf, latitude noted, instrument calibration noted. The reading was wrong, not wrong as in mistaken, wrong as in inconsistent with everything the geomagnetic record of that region shows before and after 1947. A localized anomaly of a magnitude that didn't fit the surrounding geological context. According to the Norwegian team's own analysis, the reading would require either a significant instrumentane fault or the presence of a subsurface feature of substantial and unusual magnetic density. They flagged it, noted it, and did not pursue it because it was not their study. But someone had been in the deep interior shelf and encountered something that left that reading behind. And the people who encountered it, 12 trained researchers, came home and said nothing. That is the question I keep returning to. Not because I have an answer, but because I have not yet found a question that adequately contains it. Every time I try to frame it as a problem to be solved, it turns out to be larger than the frame. Let me build outward from that single data point, because an honest investigation requires it. The Mirny survey did not occur in isolation. In the same austral summer of 1947, the United States was conducting large-scale Antarctic operations, Operation Highjump, led by Admiral Richard Byrd, deploying 13 ships and over 4,000 personnel to the continent. That operation is well documented and widely discussed. What is less discussed is a specific element of Byrd's own accounts from that period, his references to encountering phenomena that could not be classified under the expedition's standard instrumentation categories. He made these references in internal memos, not in public testimony. The memos were declassified decades later. Most analysts treat them as the impressions of an aging explorer, prone to dramatic expression. That reading may be correct. But I want to be precise about what Byrd actually wrote, because the language matters. He didn't use the word unexplained, he used the word unclassifiable. Those are not the same thing. Unexplained implies a gap in information. We don't yet know what it is. Unclassifiable implies a gap in category. We have the information but no existing framework to receive it. That is a much more specific kind of not knowing. One says, we need more data. The other says, we have the data and we don't know where to put it. In scientific practice, the difference between a research gap and a categorical crisis is enormous. Byrd chose, deliberately and specifically, the word that describes the second kind. Whether he chose it precisely or impressionistically, I cannot say for certain. Here is what I keep noticing regardless. Two separate expeditions, operating independently, from nations in the opening stages of a geopolitical competition that would define the next half-century, both returned from Antarctic operations in the same narrow window of time, both with records containing gaps, inconsistencies, or sealed sections that have never been publicly explained. That is not a theory. That is a documented fact about the documentary record itself. The obvious counter-argument, and it is a strong one, is that the Cold War context explains everything. Both superpowers were classifying anything that moved. The Antarctic was geopolitically sensitive. Any mission producing remotely strategic data would be locked down as a matter of course. The fact that both records have gaps from this period is entirely consistent with standard Cold War information management. I take that seriously. What I can't reconcile within that explanation is the granularity of the gaps. Cold War classification produces institutional silence. It removes reports, redacts documents, withholds findings. But it doesn't typically produce personal silence. It doesn't reach into a defector's published papers in West Germany in 1963 and erase a field expedition from his autobiographical record. It doesn't follow a glaciologist through 31 years of free academic output and remove 11 weeks from his cited experience. Personal silence is different from institutional silence. Institutions suppress records, people suppress references, or, more precisely, the impulse to reference memories they cannot contextualize. And what causes a person to suppress a professional experience across an entire career in contexts entirely free from institutional pressure? That question doesn't have a Cold War answer. It has a human one, and the human answers are harder to sit with. I want to be careful here because this is the point where it becomes easy to drift into unfounded psychology, to build a narrative about what people must have felt based on the gaps in their record. I'm not equipped to do that responsibly. What I can say is that the pattern of deliberate personal omission, as distinct from institutional suppression, is unusual enough to warrant attention on its own terms. And then there is the ship's log. This is the detail I return to most often, not because it is the most dramatic, but because it is the most specific and the hardest to argue around. The vessel that transported the survey team to and from the continent has a log that, according to a 2003 Finnish maritime historian who reviewed Soviet naval records from this period, ends abruptly, not at the expedition's return. The final log entry corresponding to the survey period is dated approximately 3 weeks before the team's documented arrival back at port. What happened in those 3 weeks is not recorded. The pages are present but blank, ruled, formatted, dated, and blank. The Finnish researcher noted it as an administrative curiosity, not a mystery. He moved on. I have not been able to. A ship's log is a legal document. Maritime law, even Soviet maritime law, treats it as a continuous mandatory record. Captains do not leave 3 weeks of dated pages blank as a matter of preference. The blank pages are either the result of a deliberate decision not to record, or the result of events that the person responsible chose, for some reason, not to put into writing. Both possibilities are troubling in different ways. I have spent time constructing sequences of ordinary events that might explain those blank pages. Equipment failure, illness, a navigational emergency that redirected attention. Each is plausible individually. None adequately explains why, following the return, no supplementary log entry was ever made. Maritime practice calls for retroactive notation when entries are missed. No retroactive entries exist for that 3-week period. The blank pages are just blank. Let me step back from the granular details and ask a structural question, because the structure of this situation matters as much as any individual data point within it. If you were designing a pattern that would most effectively conceal an anomalous discovery while leaving the discoverers psychologically intact and professionally functional, what would it look like? It would look, I think, almost exactly like this. That is an uncomfortable thing to say, and I want to be honest about the risk it carries. When an absence of evidence begins to look shaped, when the gaps themselves seem to take a recognizable form, you have to ask whether you are finding a pattern or creating one. That is the investigator's real adversary, not the missing data, but the human tendency to fill absence with meaning rather than with continued uncertainty. And yet the shape is there. 12 people, 2 independent national programs, 2 sets of records with specific non-overlapping gaps, a single anomalous geomagnetic reading recovered by accident 30 years later by researchers looking for something else entirely. A ship's log with 3 weeks of blank dated pages, a defector who mentioned every expedition in his career except 11 weeks in 1947. I keep reassembling these pieces, I keep arriving at the same shape. Here is the coordination problem, and I want to lay it out plainly. For the official Cold War explanation to account for all of these anomalies simultaneously, it would have to have reached across multiple countries, multiple institutions, multiple decades, and the personal publishing choices of individuals operating in entirely different political systems. The coordination that would require is not logistically impossible, but it is extraordinary enough to need explaining on its own terms. The more uncomfortable proposition is that such coordination didn't require a single architect. Institutional silence can organize itself around shared interest without anyone issuing a directive. If 12 people return from an expedition, having witnessed something they cannot categorize, something their instruments registered, but their frameworks cannot contain, the silence that follows is not necessarily imposed from outside. It can emerge from within. Shared professional uncertainty is one of the most powerful silencers in human institutional life. When you cannot explain what you witnessed in the language of your field, when the vocabulary of your training has no word for what you encountered, the safest path is to say nothing. Not because you've been told to say nothing, because saying something requires a framework, and the framework doesn't exist. The silence organizes itself. I've spoken with a researcher, I won't use her name because she didn't give me permission to, who has spent the better part of a decade studying institutional silence in Soviet scientific programs from this period. She told me that the most interesting silences in the Soviet record are not the ones that were ordered, they are the ones that happened voluntarily, because the researchers themselves didn't know what they were supposed to say. That framing changed how I looked at Gorbatov's 31-year gap. What if the omission wasn't obedience? What if it was a kind of epistemological paralysis, a condition of not knowing how to begin the sentence? What if he didn't mention the survey, not because he was told not to, but because every time he reached for it, he arrived at a description he couldn't finish? That is speculative, but it is a different kind of speculative than directed suppression. Because directed suppression has a seam in it, a place where the person almost says the thing, or references the gap, or leaves some trace of the weight they're carrying. Gorbatov's record has no such seam. The 1947 survey doesn't appear even as an absence that he circles. It simply isn't there. And that particular quality of absence, the kind that leaves no residue of the suppressed thing, no shadow of what was almost said, is harder to explain as external instruction than as internal paralysis. When someone has been told to stay silent, silence usually leaves a mark. This silence doesn't. It is complete, and completeness, in a record this otherwise meticulous, is its own category of troubling. I know how that can sound, like soft psychology stretched over hard absence. I'm aware of the risk, but there's something structurally important about silence that isn't ordered. Institutional suppression can be documented, traced, and sometimes decoded. Voluntary silence, silence that emerges from the impossibility of language rather than the prohibition of speech, is a different problem entirely, and it requires a different kind of attention. The defector is the clearest case. He lived for 18 years in West Germany, in an environment where criticizing Soviet science was not only permitted, but professionally rewarded. He had every incentive to surface the Mirny survey, if only as a narrative of Soviet suppression. He would have found audiences eager to hear it. He never mentioned it, not in public, not, so far as the archived record shows, in private correspondence either. A man who defected from the Soviet Union, spent nearly 2 decades in intellectual freedom, had every professional incentive to discuss a controversial expedition, and never did. I keep rewriting that sentence, trying to find a different ending. I keep arriving at the same conclusion. Whatever he encountered in the deep interior of Antarctica in 1947, it was not something he knew how to place into any story, not even his own. I want to address the most direct counter-argument, because it deserves a direct response. The skeptical case is simple and compelling. I am describing a historical record with gaps, and filling those gaps with significance. Researchers omit fieldwork from their published records for perfectly ordinary reasons. The work was preliminary, data was inconclusive, the expedition was professionally embarrassing, the findings were superseded. Gaps in historical records are the rule, not the exception. That is genuinely true, and I hold it. But the counter-argument has to account for the specific configuration of this gap. Not one researcher, but multiple independent researchers across different political systems. Not just institutional suppression, but personal omission in contexts where institutional pressure was absent. Not just missing findings, but a single recovered anomalous reading that independently suggests something was there to find. The ordinary explanation works for any one of these. It strains against all of them simultaneously. There is also the matter of what happened afterward. In 1958, as part of the International Geophysical Year, a landmark cooperative program that brought Soviet and Western researchers into shared frameworks for the first time, a new expedition was dispatched to a section of the interior shelf that, by the coordinates preserved in the Norwegian footnote, overlaps significantly with the Mirny survey's documented trajectory. The IGY was a moment of unusual openness between Cold War rivals. The 1958 expedition's findings from that region are publicly available and unremarkable. Standard glaciological and atmospheric data, consistent with what would be expected from the interior shelf. But here is the detail I cannot set aside. The magnetometer readings from the overlapping coordinates do not show the anomaly that the 1947 reading described, not a diminished version of it, not a trace. The anomaly is simply absent from the 1958 record, as though it had never existed. There are several sensible explanations for a geomagnetic anomaly disappearing between measurements. Subsurface geological processes can shift magnetic density over time. Instrumental calibration differences between 1947 Soviet equipment and 1958 IGY standard instruments could account for the discrepancy. The coordinates in the footnote were approximate. The two expeditions may not have been measuring precisely the same point. These are real, scientifically grounded explanations, and I take them seriously. But the 1947 reading, if accurate, described an anomaly of a magnitude that does not quietly disappear over 11 years without leaving any geological trace whatsoever. Geomagnetic anomalies at that scale leave imprints in the surrounding lithological record. The 1958 expedition found none, which means either the reading was instrumentation error or something at the site changed substantially in 11 years, and the 1958 team either didn't notice or chose not to note it. I don't know which is true. I'm not a geophysicist. I consulted two people who are, and they gave me conflicting assessments. One told me the instrumentation error hypothesis was most parsimonious. The other told me the calibration differences between Soviet 1940s magnetometers and IGY standard instruments were not sufficient to account for a discrepancy of that magnitude. I'm left with the honest admission that I cannot resolve this on technical grounds alone. What I can say is that the technical uncertainty doesn't resolve the human mystery. Even if the geomagnetic reading was purely instrumentation error, even if the anomaly was never real, the silence of 12 people, the blank pages of a ship's log, the 31-year gap in one career, the 18-year silence of a defector who had every reason to speak, these still require explanation. The geomagnetic reading is not the mystery. The people are. Let me tell you about the last member of the survey team whose biographical trail I've been able to follow. A cartographer, the kind of specialist who, in 1947, would have been responsible for documenting the expedition's precise geographical movements and producing the internal maps that would form the basis of any subsequent expedition to the same region. Cartographers are, by professional nature, documentarians. Creating records is not merely their job, it is the foundation of their discipline. This man's career after 1947 is documented. He continued working as a cartographer within the Soviet system for another 15 years, producing maps of the Siberian interior, the Caspian Basin, the Kamchatka Peninsula. His output was consistent with someone who remained professionally active, but among his archived materials, which became accessible to researchers after 1991, there are no maps from 1947, none from the Antarctic interior, not even draft sketches, not even a notation of coordinates. A cartographer spent 11 weeks in an unmapped interior region of Antarctica and produced no maps, not lost maps, not sealed maps, maps that the archival record suggests were never made at all. For 11 weeks, in a profession defined by the act of recording spatial reality, the impulse to draw, which in a cartographer is not merely professional but almost physiological, appears to have simply not operated. I don't have an explanation for that. What I have is a word for the experience that might explain it, though I use it cautiously. The word is aporia, a Greek term describing the state of confronting something genuinely irresolvable, something that cannot be approached through the available logical or linguistic tools. It is not confusion. It is not ignorance. It is the specific paralysis that follows the collision between a framework and something that the framework has no capacity to accommodate. Not the inability to understand, the inability to begin understanding. The feeling of reaching for your conceptual toolkit and finding that none of the tools are the right shape for what you're holding. I wonder if that is what 12 people brought back from the Antarctic interior in 1947. Not a discovery they were told to suppress, but an experience they had no available language for. No scientific category, no institutional framework, no professional vocabulary that could hold the shape of what they had witnessed. And if that is what they brought back, the silence makes a different kind of sense. Not the silence of keeping a secret, the silence of having nothing adequate to say. I want to pause here because this is the moment where I have to be most honest about the limits of this investigation. What I've built is not a proof. It is a pattern of absences that, taken individually, can each be explained. Taken together, they resist explanation in a way I find genuinely troubling. But resist is not the same as refute. A pattern of absences that resists explanation is still a pattern of absences, not evidence of what the absences contain. The responsible position is this. I don't know what the Mirny survey found in the deep interior shelf of Antarctica in 1947. I don't know if it found anything at all. I don't know if the geomagnetic anomaly was real or instrumental. I don't know why Gorbatov never mentioned it, or why the defector never mentioned it, or why the cartographer made no maps. I hold all of those unknowns, and I am not releasing any of them toward a conclusion. What I do know is that the shape of this silence is unusual, not unique. Institutional and personal silences of this kind have accompanied other expeditions, other discoveries, other encounters with things that did not fit the scientific vocabulary of their moment. The history of exploration is, in part, a history of things that were witnessed and not discussed, and the reasons range from the mundane to the genuinely inexplicable. The Mirny survey sits somewhere in that range. There is one more thing. I've saved it not for dramatic effect, but because it is the piece I am least confident about interpreting, and I wanted to lay down all the other material before introducing it. In 2011, a Georgian academic published a short paper in an obscure journal of Soviet scientific history. The paper dealt with something else entirely: the administrative structure of Soviet Antarctic programs in the post-war period. But in a footnote, almost parenthetically, he referenced a phrase from an internal Soviet document he had accessed during his research. The phrase, translated from the Russian, was approximately this: the nature of the observation requires that it not be classified as an observation. I want you to sit with that for a moment. That is not bureaucratic language. That is not standard Cold War operational security phrasing. It is something else entirely. It is the language of an institution that encountered something it didn't know how to categorize, and rather than classify it, chose to uncategorize it, to place it in a kind of administrative non-existence, not suppression, not secrecy, non-existence. The Georgian academic noted the phrase without comment, as though its meaning were self-evident, or perhaps as though he too didn't know what to do with it. He cited no expedition by name. The document he referenced has not been publicly released in full. I've tried to trace it. I've followed the institutional thread as far as it goes, and it goes nowhere I can follow. The footnote is just a footnote. The phrase is just a phrase. And yet the phrase is exactly what you would write if you were the administrator of an expedition whose 12 members returned having witnessed something their instruments could measure, but their frameworks could not classify. Something that produced a geomagnetic reading, unlike anything in the surrounding record, and then was absent 11 years later. Something that caused a cartographer to stop drawing, a glaciologist to stop citing, a defector to stop speaking, and a ship's captain to stop writing. That phrase, the nature of the observation requires that it not be classified as an observation, is exactly what you would write, and I cannot decide if that is evidence or coincidence, and I have been trying for a long time. I have been trying throughout this account to be fair, to present each counter-argument and give it its full weight, to acknowledge the limits of evidence and the risks of pattern seeking in incomplete records. I believe I've done that, though I've also arrived at a place where the logic of the investigation has carried me further than the evidence strictly warrants. That tension is not comfortable. I don't enjoy sitting at the edge of claims I cannot fully support, but I also can't force myself back by simply ignoring what the shape of the record looks like. The shape looks like this. In late 1947, 12 trained researchers travelled into the unmapped interior of Antarctica, encountered something that fell outside their institutional vocabulary for experience, and returned to a world that had no framework, waiting to receive what they had found. And so they said nothing, and the nothing persisted, and we are still, 75 years later, inside it. I don't know what they saw. I'm not sure the question of what they saw is even the most important question anymore. The question that stays with me, the one that has been quietly widening at the back of my thinking, is what it means for something to be observed and then deliberately uncategorized. What it means to choose administrative non-existence for an experience. What it means when the silence is not about hiding the thing, but about the absence of language for it. Because if the language doesn't exist, the thing itself becomes a kind of ghost. It happened. The instruments registered it. 12 people were present. A ship's log kept dated pages waiting to be filled, and none of it got written. Not because it was forbidden, or not only because it was forbidden, but because writing requires a framework, and the framework wasn't there. I think sometimes about what it would feel like to carry that for 31 years without ever finding the words. Antarctica is, in the most literal sense, the place on Earth where human conceptual frameworks have historically arrived last. The language for what the continent is, its geological identity, its subsurface architecture, its behavior as an ice system, is still being revised in real time. We mapped the surface before we understood what lived beneath it. We catalogued its coastline before we comprehended its interior. It consistently produces observations that outpace the frameworks available to interpret them. That much is uncontested, and it matters because it means the problem the Mirny survey team encountered, if they encountered a problem at all, would not have been without precedent in the broader history of Antarctic science. Researchers from multiple nations and generations have returned from the continent having recorded data that didn't resolve cleanly into their available frameworks. The continent generates anomalies. That is simply what it does. And when an expedition returns with anomalous data, the normal trajectory is that the anomaly eventually gets discussed. Cautiously, uncertainly, but eventually, it enters the record in some form, even as a footnote, even as an instrument reading flagged for follow-up, even as the briefest acknowledgement that something didn't fit. That is the normal trajectory. Whatever the Mirny survey generated, if it generated anything, apparently did not follow it, not in the years immediately after, not in Gorbatov's 31-year career, not in the 18 years the defector spent in West German academic freedom, not in the decade since the Cold War's end and the partial opening of Soviet records. Whatever it was, it did not surface. That absence, sustained across so many contexts and so many decades, is the thing I find hardest to dismiss. Anomalies resurface. Data finds its way out. Even constrained researchers leave traces of the things they cannot say in the margins of notebooks, in the phrasing of papers, in the questions they choose not to ask. This anomaly left none of those traces, not a marginal notation, not a hesitation in a published paper, not a question pointed in the direction of something unresolved. It left only the shape of itself, in negative, the outline of something that was there and then wasn't, and was never explained, and apparently never wanted to be. I've been sitting with that shape for long enough that it has started to feel less like a mystery and more like a kind of answer. Not an answer to what was found, an answer to what kind of thing it was. In cartography, an unmapped region is called a terra incognita, unknown land. In the older maps, before the age of satellites, unknown territory was sometimes marked with the notation Hic sunt dracones, here be dragons. Not because cartographers believed in dragons, but because they needed a placeholder, a notation that acknowledged the limit of knowledge without pretending to resolve it. The notation said, "The known world ends here. What begins on the other side, we cannot yet say." I think about the cartographer from the Mirny survey. I think about 11 weeks that produced no maps, and I think here, apparently, was something for which even the notation for the unknown was not sufficient. No dragons, no terra incognita, no placeholder at all. Just 11 weeks of blank space where a professional lifetime of careful documentation simply stopped and never explained why. That is where I have to leave this. Not because I've reached an answer, but because the investigation, followed honestly to its furthest point, arrives at a door rather than a room. Whatever happened in the Antarctic interior in 1947 is somewhere on the other side, filed perhaps in a language that may not exist yet, in an archive that has been waiting for more than 75 years for someone equipped with the right framework to open it. I don't know if that person is coming. I don't know if the framework is something that can be built from outside whatever sealed record still holds the full account of those 11 weeks. But the door is there, and what unsettles me most, what I keep returning to in the quiet, sitting with all of this, is that the door doesn't appear to be locked. It appears to simply be waiting for a question specific enough and properly framed enough to finally be the right one to open it.